Welcome, everyone. So my name is Patrick Paul. I'm president of the society. So this is we're in the 178th year and the second ordinary session of this year. And I'm delighted to welcome Gregory Swinand from Indicon. He's going to present a paper, The Potential Impact of Changes in Burden of Proof to Determine Suicide in Ireland. And just to say, this is a triggering topic, so just to say that we are talking about something sensitive, and we do have some smartness in the room afterwards, so we do have to have someone to subside. You have the floor, 40 minutes.
Thank you very much. So thanks everyone for coming. Special thanks to Ronnie, who gave some helpful comments in the room. Dr. Ronnie, two of my colleagues, other colleagues, too numerous to mention. It's talk about the potential impact of changes in the burden of proof to determine suicide. And without further ado, the agenda will just give an introduction. We'll give a review of the literature. We'll talk about the DID, which is the difference in difference method, talk about data, results, and discussions. And just to introduce the literature, you know, suicide is a very important problem globally in any country. I think it's you could easily underestimate it, or it's difficult to overestimate it. Globally, just a data point of about 700,000 deaths attributed to suicide. That's WHO data. And suicide is unequivocally one of the leading causes of death in Ireland, especially among young people. You know, when I was writing the paper and working on it, I actually had immediately SSISI in my mind, because I think the ethos of the society is to give a nexus of statistics, policy, and law. And what I thought was going to be merely a statistical exercise immediately became this nexus of all these other things that I thought, gee whiz, that would be interesting. So there's going to be a variety of factors in the presentation. We'll start with some of the legal elements and then move on to some of the data and the statistics. And the key thing here is the standard of proof. And most of us are probably familiar with standards of proof and the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, which is the criminal standard. And then there's other standards like the civil standard, which is the preponderance of the probabilities, or the balance of the probabilities. Believe it or not, there are other standards. There are unconscionable standards, such as what would be a standard to challenge a national regulatory authority, such as ComReg, where some people are
Used to be.
okay, just adding that in. But there are other standards. But the interesting thing here is that recently the UK changed its standard, and the UK and Ireland have a reasonable basis in common law that they might be considered similar, and therefore we have a natural experiment that might give us some insight into what would happen. And this work we did as a result of some pro bono work that we did for the Hug charity, and then this paper was a result. So this table is developed from published CSO data, and with the help of some research assistant colleagues, we developed this just mimicking some other data that's published for the USA. It's showing the leading causes of death using published ICD-10 classification data for Ireland, and then aggregating over the last 3 years available, which was 18 to 21. And as we can see, if we just look up here, for the leading cause of death for folks, you know, people 10 to 19 is intentional self-harm. Then the next second bet is 20 to 29, down like this. So there's this pattern like that. So it is the leading cause of death for young people, or the second or third most for middle age, and even up to 50 to 59 years, it's the fifth leading cause. Now, once you reach 60 and over, then you can see, first of all, that the numbers of deaths, you know, of course, go up a lot because people are dying of old age. So it's no longer the top 10, but not to say that suicide isn't an important thing in old folks as well. And we go into that in places. If you look at USA statistics, we have an absolute epidemic of suicide among, interestingly enough, white males over 70 and a number, but different topic. Understanding the reasons for the burden of proof and the impact of that, we wanted to unpack some of the legal origins, and there's also elements of the religious and philosophical origins. The paper goes into a lot of details. It's fairly, you get down into the weeds of this, but that was actually sort of the fun of it and some of the interest, so I won't be able to cover it all, but you know, the fundamental origins go back pre-Socrates. It's similar thinking in Hebrew and Islamic law, but the philosophical origins were really that somehow man was not responsible for his own being, if I put it in so many words. And it's really that there are higher orders of beings, such as God or king or that sort of thing. You know, that man, and I mean mankind, men and women, you know, had an obligation towards, and there are a variety of reasons for this. I'm not trying to be judgmental about it, but just to quote what is somebody translating Socrates, it's man as one of God's possessions should not kill himself until God sends some compulsion upon him. And this extended then into Roman times and then further on in medieval times, because we can imagine the ideas of divine right, kings and sovereigns. And this sort of thinking then extended to the same sort of power. And then as a further continuation into medieval Britain, from which common law was giving the common law basis of law to Ireland as being part of Britain. And there was legal doctrine for Britain that was suicide was considered a crime as early as the 13th century. I didn't put all the sites in it, but this is drawing heavily on somebody named Rooney, who's from UCD. So anyway, special thanks to the work that she did here. There were other reasons that they had. The king would have rights to, if you were condemned to death for a crime, the king would confiscate all your property and all your lands and everything. But then at a certain point, he didn't get the land, so there was an incentive to actually use suicide. And people really did think about their heirs keeping the land as the most valuable thing. So of course the king didn't want to lose out on that or have this sort of thing. So they actually changed some of the early law. And then it wasn't until the 19th century that an official act, the Burial of Suicide Act, which forbade the practice, and we get a quote from Rooney, I believe, the practice of burying those who committed suicide at a crossroads with a stake through their heart. And this was Britain, not just Ireland, it was everywhere. These were very, you know, these kind of medieval thoughts about life and death and being buried in the cemetery or not, were something were much more European, I think, and it's not, we shouldn't think of them as just Irish, you know. Then in the late 19th century Britain, they changed the law, but sorry, in the early 20th century, 19th century Britain, they changed law, but as late as the late 19th century, there was still a lagging effect of where the thinking about suicide had not really caught up with the legal doctrine of the statute. And somebody who was a noted physician noted that apparently from public records, about 98% of successful suicides were ruled as due to temporary insanity, while only 4% of attempted suicides were deemed to be attempted insanity. And what it was is, obviously, when people were presumably intentionally self-harming themselves, which resulted in death, that the verdicts were coming back as that they must have been temporarily insane, that they didn't actually have responsibility for their acts. And again, I'm not trying to make light of such a heavy subject, but it really is perhaps the first example where people are starting to look at statistics and incongruities and see what the results of these might be for public health and public policy outcomes. And that's sort of really some of the motivation for the topic. Besides this idea of the thought of the origins of suicide and thinking about it, there's also the element of the standards of proof and the beyond a reasonable doubt. And there are other separate legal doctrines that and origins that come with that. And again, the origins go back to Hebrew, Roman, Islamic laws, and even things like Genesis had not exactly analogous references, but there's at least many of us might have heard of that Abraham asked God would he spare Sodom if there were at least 10 righteous men in the city, and he said indeed he would. And as we see, standards of proof then evolved over time. In medieval Europe with the church, they had a whole sort of history of early medieval trials by ordeal, which was, led to crazy outcomes of people, you were a witch if you floated on the water, and you were not a witch if you sunk, but of course then you were dead, all this kind of stuff. And ultimately the church banned trials by ordeal. I think the exact date is in the paper, but it's something over the 15th, 16th century. Then it was really a bit later in the 18th century that we first see sort of the modern articulation of sort of a rational standard of proof coming into criminal law. And this is from a famous jurist named Blackstone, who articulated what was known as the 10-to-1 principle. And it's somewhat of where the balance of beyond a reasonable doubt comes out. And he said, quote, "It's better that 10 guilty persons escape than one innocent suffer." So within that, though, there's developed two views of the rationale for why this beyond a reasonable doubt standard developed. And one is kind of the analogy to proof by contradiction, such as what we do with statistics, right? If you have a certain level of probability that you're wrong by the type 1 error, which might be 10-to-1, you're willing to conclude that statistical proof is made. Alternatively, there's another view that the real goal of this was to lift moral responsibility from the church or judges who were passing judgment on people or condemnation, because effectively the condemnation was on their hands. And maybe there are different ideas and different importance of this in terms of when we look at what the implications of changing the burden of proof are. Now, just to review the Irish law very quickly, there's the Coroners Act of 1962 that was revised in 22. And then there was a revision in 93 that changed the view that suicide was a criminal offense. So prior to that, it was viewed as a criminal offense, but that is no longer the case. There's no longer a statutory basis for the standard of proof to be beyond the reasonable doubt, which is the criminal standard. Now, UK law, as I said, the basis was similar, and then it was the common law basis that we both share. And then they had updated Coroner's and Justice Act of 29, and that was the legislation underpinning the coroner's responsibilities. But it wasn't changed by statute. The change of the application of the standard was done by precedent, and a UK Supreme Court decision in a case known as Maughan that was decided in 2018. And I won't read all of that out, but that's just a quote from the press brief on the Supreme Court decision. And it was somebody who had been in prison and apparently had committed an act of intentional self-harm, but on the basis of beyond a reasonable doubt, the coroner concluded that it would have been not suicide. But then he went back and instructed the jury to use the balance of the probabilities instead, which the appeal said should not be done. But the Supreme Court then said no, the rational basis, given there's no longer any crime involved, should be the civil basis. Just looking at some data now, we're looking here at some ONS data that's just published data and what has happened. We're looking at just a few things that will illustrate some of the things of just intentional self-harm and undetermined in England and Wales. These are just the percentage of these two categories. So that's why the male and female are of similar height. Men overall are about 4 times likely to commit suicide or an act of intentional self-harm that results in death. So in the absolute scale, the men would be much higher. But what we can see is that a relatively similar amount as a percentage of male and female total deaths are broken down between undetermined and intentional self-harm, which are the ICD-10 classifications. Incidentally, as we see, MON is right about here in 2018. There's an apparent reduction here and an apparent increase here, which is at least casually consistent with the idea that changing the burden of proof would increase the measured rate and shift some undetermined to the determined. But we want to have a, that's just a casual observation. We want to have a more solid statistical study of the problem. Looking at NI data, we're talking much smaller numbers, and this is just published data from NISRA. There's a break in the series, and there doesn't seem, and MON applied an NI with a 6-month lag. So the change in the standard is there, but we don't necessarily, it's more difficult to ascertain any sort of even casual causal effect to the change due to MON. Now, just comparing, these are rates now, and this is just published figures from CSO, just comparing to Ireland and comparing ROI to Scotland, England, Wales. There's no apparent, it doesn't really appear to be much of a difference in terms of the trends across them. And we at least see relatively similar trends. Notably also is that there are differences across the different, there's a much higher rate in Scotland, and ROI in England and Wales are of a similar rate. The paper goes into a lot more detail in the jurisdictions that also share common law basis, such as USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The USA, of course, has common law basis with everywhere but Louisiana, which is Napoleonic code. Just you probably didn't know that. But if your wife studied law in America, you would. So every state is a law state. Similarly, Canada is the same thing. Every province, but Quebec. Canada incidentally changed from the criminal standard to the civil standard in 2009, and incidentally, we did run the analysis on them, but it didn't satisfy some of the needed assumptions. New Zealand still has the criminal standard, and Australia has the civil standard. And again, we looked at some comparisons. You need to do some sort of matched comparisons by demographics or by localities, but obtaining the micro data, it could have been still group data, but we were unable to obtain data on those. And I won't go into much of the detail. There's still tertiary literature, a lot of it focusing on the opioid drugs crises, which is mainly in America, but also in Canada and somewhat. And this, of course, exacerbates the problems of determination of cause of death because of the introduction of problems with opioids that may blur the intention or the perceived or ascertained intention. So we look into that more in the paper, so I'm not going to go into it here. Finally, looking in Ireland, there's not a lot of literature on this anywhere, and there's not a lot of anywhere in Ireland, but there is a particularly important study done fairly recently called the IPSDS. And this was a pooled data expert panel approach where they looked at, among other things, there were lots of things in it, and for some reason, they didn't come out with This is some of their headline results of the study. But what they did is they included, it was a joint effort by the HSC, the coroner's office, and the Health Research Board, and they convened an expert panel and got microdata and pooled all the data sources such as GARDA, the coroner's inquest data, etc. And first of all, they said that based on the weight of the evidence, any death that seemed to be potentially suicide include in their study. And then they broke those down into the beyond a reasonable doubt, the balance of the probabilities categories. So at least on the first instance, we can see at least some estimate that something about 31% would have been in the balance of the probabilities area, and potentially, at least if the standard were changed, that would be changed to registering death as a suicide. As I said, there's probably some nuances there, and I just want to say that the study itself didn't make that conclusion, so I'm just making a very broad observation and not trying to get into specific arguments on that. So we want to use this natural experiment, and we're going to use the data that we have, and we're able to rely on published data. And how are we going to do it? DID is difference in difference. It's one of the most venerable quantitative methods to infer causal inference, which we mean by inferring a treatment effect, really. Curiously, and perhaps less than pure coincidence, it has its origins back in the 19th century from in the public health sphere from somebody who was named called Snow, who was a physician studying cholera in London. And he collected data before and after in different localities in London where better water infrastructure was installed, and looked at the rates of cholera infection given that, and inferred that it was dirty water that was causing cholera. And then just to look at this, the key idea is that fundamentally you have a pre-intervention period from your treated and untreated groups, and then over the periods you study and make some assessment statistically of whether they can have parallel trends, and then the treatment effect is the effect to which the treated group deviates from the original trend, right? So that's the graphical interpretation of DID in a nutshell. And we can also write it out as an equation. Now, some of us are statisticians and like equations, but for those who don't, it's not as ugly an equation as it looks. It's really just saying we can estimate it by ordinary least squares. It's that's basic linear regression, one of the most fundamental techniques. What it's really saying is that there are just fixed effects across the countries, where those are in our case, it's countries, right? C. And then the fixed effects, they vary across country, but not by time. And then there are fixed time effects that vary by time, but not across countries. There may be other variables that are in there. The assumptions of the model are fairly straightforward, and we'll argue about some, and we'll do some others in terms of statistical tests. The main assumptions are parallel trends, no endogenous treatment effects, and stable unit treatment values, of which there's no treatment spillovers, and a clear definition of treatment. As you'll see, the parallel trends, the assessment of that assumption is based on a joint statistical test of the trends. The no endogenous treatment assignment, we're going to argue is satisfied just by the nature of how the treatment was assigned through the Supreme Court decision. We shouldn't expect any endogeneity to that. It could be, not impossible. The stable unit treatment values, I would just argue that there shouldn't have been spillovers. Why would that mean that the outcomes in Ireland, at least on such a short time trend, any spillovers now are only, we're addressing them now. And the clear definition of treatment is pretty clear. It's the change in the standard, and that was the legal standard that everybody applied. So we'd expect that was pretty clear. Okay, the data data was published, ONS, CSO, and NISRA, public online sources, accessed maybe about, it's in the paper. There are two main data sets that we use. One was the suicide rates. It's ONS tables 1 and 2 on death rates, and CSO VSD 32. And there was also a small thing of the last 2 years late registration. They're not included. And what we have is a time series of late registrations and predicted late registrations with an OLS model. And that's from VSD 33. The second data set is then on actual numbers of deaths, and that's using the ICD-10 classifications, which are group data, but broken down into very detailed demographic categories and cause of death categories. So we have all the detail of a similar classification and grouping system across ONS and CSO. The data were over time and by gender for all data sets. So we got actually quite a lot of observations, which was very good. And for the ICD-10 cross-classified by gender, age, cause, the 4-digit ICD-10 code. And then we also coded separate group variables by the different death cause classifications in ICD-10. ICD-10, the subcategories X60 to X84 are all categorized as intentional self-harm. And then ICD-Y10 to Y30 are all, it says I think it says unintended, but it might be done. Yes, unintended. Okay. So we actually have 2 different group categories within that data set. So the results, there are 2 sets of tables, and we did some we did results running a number of different models for sensitivity. The first is aggregating sample across England and Wales, RNI, NOI. It's a suicide rate as a dependent variable. It's a yearly time dummy. It's all age categories, both genders pooled. The parameter of interest is the average treatment effect on the treated, or the ATEP. And this is about 2.5 percentage point increase in the rate, which is the dependent variable. And then the p-value, which being low, gives the statistical significance. The number of obs for the pooled sample is slower because we haven't broken into male, female, etc. And finally, the final column is the statistical test for parallel trends. It's an F test because it's a joint statistical test that there's a number of years before and after. And it's a test that those years are jointly different or jointly similar. Of note is, you can always think of things about the power of the test. The null hypothesis is that we can use parallel trends. So I've just given I haven't given the actual numbers because they're all strongly significant, and it's less than the critical value for all but our last one where we compared the Republic to Northern Ireland. There we violated parallel trends, and similarly we got a very small estimated ATET, which of course need not be interpreted because we violated the fundamental assumption. If we look it looks, an interesting thing is perhaps just that there's very little variation in the actual estimated ATET by breaking down by male, female, by changing some of the sensitivities by just comparing Wales to ROI, by just comparing some other things. This one here, if you're wondering what this means, what we did is we said, what if we looked at the comparisons of the time dummies and did it on a 5-year basis rather than the yearly basis, just on the sensitivity as to the definition of what parallel trends mean. And it just made very little difference to the end. So the next set of results is using the wider data set and which is the deaths data from ICD-10 classification system. And this is only comparing England and Wales to ROI because this is the only data sets that were published publicly and we could get comparable bases. But then within this, we're able to do other things to try to break down and look at separate samples for different age groups and different genders and things like that. So first, we look at the pooled sample with England and Wales, ICD-10, which is the intentional self-harm categories. And the ATET is now 1.27, and this is not a rate now, it's deaths. So to create, we either need to back that out into rates or back the rates to deaths based on the numbers in order to make comparable values, but we'll look at that later. We fail to reject the parallel trends assumption for a number of these. Now, if we look at nonetheless young people, males and females, here we have a positive and larger value, which is statistically significant, but we're getting into bordering on rejecting on a 10% significance level, the parallel trends assumption. So for these, we're in sort of dodgy territory for parallel trends, so you might not interpret these too strongly. If we go further down for females, we get a similar result, but then here we're very clearly rejecting parallel trends. So to break those down and study those in more detail, you want to look at different methods. You can think about what to do, perhaps some form of matching, and you can have combined methods of trends and match samples and things like that. But we didn't go into that. Looking down further, then the key thing here is that this is the data for undetermined intention. Okay, so it's a different data set, and the ATET is negative, and that's kind of consistent with our broad a priori expectations, which is that it would increase, the change in the burden of proof would increase the measured deaths for the intentional self-harm category, but presumably some of this is undetermined is shifting or being reduced, and that's consistent with that a priori hypothesis, the results that we get here. For the pooled all age category, we're in a very large sample, but we're bordering on rejecting the parallel trends. But then for the pooled young person sample, we are going to fail to reject parallel trends. So we like that in terms of statistical belief. So we, at least for young people pooled, find that there's seemingly unequivocal statistical evidence that it's both reduced the number of undetermined deaths in England and Wales, as well as increased the numbers that are attributed to intentional self-harm. So, it's important to put this into context, and just some rough ideas and numbers of comparing the two. The rates indicate about a 20 to 25% increase in the rate, and the similar results, you have to look at the numbers in the categories and convert that to rate, but it's a similar size rate of about 20% increase. That compares, I would say, broadly consistently with the IP-SDS study, which was about 31%, but maybe that because they had an expert panel approach, they had a larger number, or there may be other things that we didn't account for. And then, again, there's some lagging things of what the exact number is in terms of the baseline number for numbers of suicides in Ireland, but there's some random error. But if we just took 500, which is very close to some of the numbers with the late registrations added, that would 20% increase to 25% increase would give us about a 100 to 125 count predicted increase per year. So it's quite substantial in terms of numbers. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, it's perhaps difficult to overstate the importance of this, but that's just the relative importance. But nonetheless, again, I don't want to get into too many debates, but I've just reinterpreted the table by taking the 3-year numbers from the original table that we looked at of the leading causes of death in Ireland over 3 years by age. And then I multiplied the intentional self-harm category by 1.2 to just give the predicted new figure, and then reordered the categories. So we remember that it had this pattern like this, and it's bumped, it's moved this one ahead of, it's moved for 20 to 29-year-olds ahead of accidents. It's moved this one up ahead of malignant neoplasm. It's moved, so it's really bumped them all up by one category, just to show the relative importance of what this might do. And I think that's quite significant, just in terms of public policy and all that sort of thing. At the beginning of the paper, reviewed some press articles of effort taken on road deaths and all those sort of things, and that was been it's now out of the press, but whenever we started writing the paper, that there was a sudden burst of news activity around road deaths and efforts from the RSA, and seemingly there hasn't been a very large decrease in the rates of deaths for roads, and that's from a variety of interventions, like part of it just being getting motorways and that sort of thing, but also awareness programs, and just comparing the importance and what was done there. There's obviously a lot of things that need to be done, and then we haven't had time to go into that. I'm just being a statistician. I'm focusing on what I can say. A few just words about the limitations of the analysis are always appropriate. There are the normal caveats of statistics on data, the model assumptions, the wrong model, and of course, your statistical error. Within the statistical error, there are sub-arguments about power of the test. And I will mention more than that. Perhaps the more important assumption is, of course, we've estimated the average treatment effect on the treated, which was the treatment effect on England and Wales, or the wider UK, etc. And we don't know for sure that same treatment effect would hold in Ireland. And that's just an open question. Nonetheless, I think we've corroborated a number of different sources, and they're broadly in line with the only data and study that really gets at the heart of the matter that's recently been done in Ireland, which is the IPSDS. So I think that's our best comparison corroboration, but there'll be some remaining doubt, but that's where we are. Finally, just to review, going back to these religious and philosophical roots, obviously understanding these origins, I think, are important in terms of understanding why there might be barriers to change or that sort of thing. And of course, those are important in terms of pushing policy through and people impacting policy decisions. Similarly, those legal standards of the burden of proof need to be taken into account. I don't want to argue too much about morality one way or the other, but obviously there are other factors, and designing policy, I think, obviously needs to take these things into account. It's an open argument what the modern views of the individual sovereignty and how that should impact logical proof, that sort of thing. And I want to just take note of those, but obviously they're individual things that ultimately come down to political decisions. In other words, that's what we have politics for. These things, the economists or statisticians make recommendations, but the political decisions might need statutory movement. So I think there's really not much more to say. We used a variety of data sets, as the quantitative approach was DID, just the first step in obvious all the policy things that are needed. I think that's it.
Okay, and maybe we'll sit down. Yeah. And we'll bring it back what we're doing. So our first vote of thanks comes from Sarah Stack, who's the communications manager. So that is the great talk. Right, so work right.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you. Right, thanks for presentation, but also thanks for giving your time to hold. It's an amazing organisation that we respect a lot. To be honest, an amazing moment. So thank you for that. To be able to give your time to something like that to come out with results like this is incredible. Thank you, Paul, for having us, and John and Kira for the work behind the scenes on tonight. And thank you for having me here on behalf of Samaritans. It's really important that we look at all of the statistics behind suicide, but just for the room, we have to remember behind every statistic, behind every number, there's a person, there's a family grieving after a tragedy, there is a community grieving. And we always remember those people at times when we speak about data and statistics, and especially this time of year. So it's just to remember those people at this time of year. At Samaritans, our vision is that fewer people die by suicide, and we aim to do this in many ways. We are best known for the helpline, free phone helpline. We have 2,000 incredible volunteers across the country. They're 24 hours a day, including Christmas Day, and they take the phone calls from people who isolated, lonely, up to actively seeking to take their life, and our volunteers take those calls. We also work in communities and prisons and schools and our festivals to try and target people who might be at risk. And then another part of our work is working with policymakers, the National Office of Suicide Prevention, and other organisations. We all work closely together as well to try and influence change, especially following the election there. But examining data is a part of all that work. And to prevent suicide, we need to know where people die, how many people die, the age, the gender, the demographics, the issues behind them. And without all those details, it's very hard to target and support the people who might be at risk of suicide. So that's the reason we really need this data. It helps us target suicide preventative actions across the board. We've heard how the change in 2018 in England and Wales and Northern Ireland was lowered from beyond reasonable doubt to the balance of probabilities. And it was really significant. And although it didn't change the data too much there, because undetermined intent was always included in suicide rates. So while the undetermined intent dropped, the classifications for suicide rose. So it sort of leveled off. But we don't have undetermined intent classification here. So, but that did mean that policies all across the country, organisations could go out really and try and target the right groups, the right ages, and try and get supports in place at that stage. Because we have coroner and jury system here for beyond reasonable doubt, quite often if there is a concern that it's not a suicide, or if there's a question about it, it can be marked as accidental or misadventure. For example, and speaking of the car crashes, it's an example we always give. We've had so many young men in single road accidents with questions over their background, but it's investigated as a road traffic accident. It doesn't go into mental health, suicidal ideation, where they were, like when I say where they were, I mean mentally before the accident. And it's about trying to look more into those kind of accidents. We've always said as well, like the road deaths are there's 3 times more suicides than road deaths a year. Now that may have changed last year. We had an awful increase in road accidents. But when you say that, you hear road accidents on the news all the time. Every time you hear that on the news, think of 2 more people who have lost their life by suicide somewhere in the country. And that's why we need to try and sort of get a handle on the data more. We fully understand how sensitive these classifications are for families who've lost a loved one. Every family's experience is unique, it's tragic, and their perspective on how their loved one's death should be recorded can vary greatly. I've seen families, I was previously a journalist that covered the coroner's courts for years. I've seen families really argue that a suicide is recorded, and I've seen families argue that a suicide is not recorded. And that can even change depending on where you are around the country, how well the family is known, how well the coroner knows people. Like, so it can be very hard that way, but it can be difficult for families who want a certain outcome, and maybe the full evidence isn't there to support a suicide verdict, but they genuinely feel it was. So we believe any changes to the system, while it includes the key decision makers, must include consultation with bereaved families. We work several organisations, including Hope, work closely with bereaved families, and it really makes a difference. The impact for not having this data means organisations like Samaritans, like PH, like others, we can be trying to target the wrong group, the wrong age group. You saw there how the shift went up the box there. Like, it's really interesting. If you're targeting the wrong age groups with the preventative measures, is it having an impact on the ground? And that's one that really will be a real concern for organisations, to know that you're targeting the right people. And while it's no longer a criminal offence, as I said, there is stigma around suicide in certain areas. It's not in all areas, and as I said, families and communities view it differently. So that's another area that would be hard to work on as well. A big area of concern in Ireland is the length of time it takes to get data. Like, on November the 25th, only a few weeks ago, we got the final stats for 2021 from the Central Statistics Office. That's nearly 3 years after, and yet we're meant to respond to it. We will know if there's I use the word cluster of deaths. We hear that from the National Office of Suicide Prevention. We work closely with organisations like Irish Rail and others. If there's incidents like that, we go out and we support the staff and commuters. So we do respond as quick as we can, but there is still that gap to think, why does it take that long? The investigative process, the hearing of the inquest, the recording of the data, it's just such a long time frame. In Scotland, for example, it takes 8 days to register a suspected suicide. Because most cases would be, like, unless there's a really grey area around the case, most would be recognised quite early. So, but here it's quite hard to tailor the services to the groups most at risk. But measuring the success or lack of our efforts to reduce suicide, it all requires access to this timely, accurate data, and including agreed definitions as well, because definitions are varying from country to country. So it's even hard to compare proper statistics with other countries, because we have a different level of what we all classify. And again, for us at Samaritans, and most organisations are the same, and a lot of policymakers are the same, the whole aim of everything we do is to try and reach people before we actually get the new statistics. So key figures are up, and it goes back to the vision of fewer people dying by suicide. I suppose just before I finish up, probably you can too quick, was it? Before I finish up, it's a reminder tonight can be triggering for people. No one knows what people are going through in the background or have gone through in the past. So organisations like Samaritans are there to support people. If you're reporting or covering suicide, we have our immediate guidelines, and they are they're regarded by widely in the industry. So they're on our website, and on anything about our service or our policy work, it's all on smartens.ie, or feel free to contact me at any time. But it is just to remember the people behind the stats. The stats are really, really important, but there's families out there too, and yeah, it's just to remember all that for them.
So our second vote of thanks is Mary Hall from BCU, which exciting. the School of Mathematical Sciences, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. So I would just like to thank Greg for his paper. I put a paper, it was very thorough and a much needed investigation into the classification of suicide deaths in Ireland. And as discussed by Greg and then by Sarah, suicide is a major issue in Ireland and globally today. And accurate classification and recording of suicide fatalities is fundamental to understanding the scale of the problem and developing strategies to tackle that crisis. So Gregory's paper, it outlined the historic basis underlying the high burden of proof required for suicide classification in Ireland and in other countries, and the changing international standards where lower burdens of proof are being adopted. So by analysing the impact of adopting those standards, Greg showed that there was a significant increase in deaths classified as suicide in Ireland, and of course that then will have implications for suicide prevention at all levels. As both Greg and Sarah discussed, the quality of suicide statistics in Ireland is dependent on accurate, timely and comprehensive data on deaths due to suicide. And as Gregory said in his paper, there's a long lead time to finalise suicide statistics in some countries. And I think this is a particular concern in Ireland. Now, the Central Statistics Office, the CSO in Ireland, it publishes finalised annual death data 22 months, now that's the cut-off period, 22 months after each year end in their Vital Statistics annual report. Now, however, there is still, even post that 22-month cut-off period, there is still delays in registering deaths, and which results in some deaths being registered after this cut-off period, and they are referred to as late registrations. So both Greg and Sarah have touched on this, and so this is included in the official final statistics and CSO annual reports. Now, there's various reasons for the delays in registering deaths, but late registrations, they primarily affect deaths due to external causes, which in Ireland must be referred to a coroner. And the lag, and as stated by the CSO, the lag resulting from coroner investigations is particularly pronounced for suicides. So I just used data from the CSO website, it's table VSD34. I only downloaded it last week. So it's fairly up-to-date data. So just using data from the CSO website, I've shown here late registered suicides as a proportion of the annual suicide deaths for each year between 2007 and 2020. And you can see that the late registered deaths, they're rising. So back in 2007, it was around about 5%, up to 2017. You know, that the proportion of late registered deaths is increasing over time. The blue bars are for males, the orange bars are for females, and you can see late registered deaths, they are greater as a proportion for female deaths, suicides. So this is just showing the late registered suicides as a proportion of the annual suicides for each year between 2007 and 2020 for males and females. As I said, the proportion of late registered deaths, it's increasing over time, and in general, it's greater for females than for males. Now, these late registered deaths, if you look at the CSO data, they tend to peak about 2 to 4 years post the year of occurrence before tapering off. And consequently, you can expect the late registrations for the most recent years there to increase further as further late registrations come along. Late registrations, you know, it negatively impacts, severely negatively impacts the quality of suicide statistics, and it affects comparability between countries and over time. Now, in particular, there is a risk of under-reporting deaths due to suicide if the impact of late registrations is not understood or allowed for. And as Greg discussed, lowering the burden of proof required to classify a death as suicide, it could be expected that would improve, or would hopefully improve, the timeliness of the production of comprehensive suicide statistics for Ireland. And it's the quality of those suicide statistics which are particularly important. Just also wanted to say a little bit, to pick up a little bit what Greg was saying on the difference between suicide rates between males and females. So as discussed, or as noted by Greg in his paper, suicide rates are higher for males than females, with males universally having circa doubled rates compared to females. Now, however, I would just like to point out that it's worth noting that in contrast to males, females in Ireland have exhibited deteriorating suicide trends in recent years. So in this figure here, I've just shown the age standardised mortality rates for suicides in Ireland over the period 2010 to 2021 for males and females. So males is the blue bar along the top, females are the orange bar along the bottom. So it's over a 10-11 year period. These age standardised mortality rates, they are calculated by reference to deaths classified under ICD code X60 to X84. So it's intentional self-harm suicide deaths. They're obtained from the CSO table VSA35, which takes account for late registered deaths. The deaths are standardised relative to the 2021 population for males and females. Now, you can see for yourself that in general, males tend to show a decreasing mortality trend due to suicides over the period 2010 to 2021. While females, they show a relatively stable trend before tending to increase slightly in recent years. And as I said, deaths due to suicide in the most recent years, they're likely to increase further due to late registrations, which also has a greater impact on females than on males. Now, I've not shown it here, but further analysis of this data, when you break it down then by individual age group, further analysis of these age standardised mortality rates for suicides showed a sharp increase for females aged 20 to 39, so young females aged 20 to 39 for the period 2017 to 2019 relative to a decade earlier, 2007 to 2009. So there was a sharp increase in suicides registered for females, young females 20 to 39 over that 10-year period. Now, this is consistent with recent research, which shows an increasing suicide trend amongst young females. I also noticed when I was looking at the data, age standardised mortality rates for suicides at older ages, and that would be 80 plus, also showed an increase over the same period for both males and females. Now, while males still experience significantly higher suicide rates compared to females, action is needed, I think, to prevent the deteriorating trend in female suicides from continuing. And just finally, I just think it's worth considering suicide patterns during the pandemic years 2020 and 2021. Now, I guess it might be a little early to comment on the data for 2021 due to the potential impact of late registrations. If you look at the results there for 2020, it shows that males experienced a decrease in suicides in 2020 relative to the previous year. In contrast, females showed an increase in suicides in 2020 relative to 2019. So 2020 was the first year of the pandemic before vaccinations, it would be the height of the pandemic. So males showed a decrease based on this data, which could change due to late registrations. However, based on this data, males showed a decrease in suicides in 2020 relative to the pre-pandemic year 2019, and vice versa for females. Now, increased suicide rates amongst females during the pandemic was noted by other researchers out there in other countries. Also, just to note, the emergence of long COVID and its negative correlation with mental health, is that also a cause for concern when we're considering future suicide trends? Just to say yet again, Greg, he presented an excellent analysis of the complexities of classifying deaths and suicide. And it is a very timely reminder on the need to improve the quality of suicide statistics. So a very, very informative paper, I thought.
Thanks, so I'll take some, if you'd like to join, Greg. So thanks, two excellent votes there, so thanks very much.
Three things just on John Fitzgerald. Three things on the data and the delays, and having worked on the data, I think they've got worse. Now, it's not that Owen can answer for the CSO, but my understanding, having been on to CSO, it's not the CSO. The CSO publishes the data when they get them. There's a problem, and the coroner system and the delays is bad for everybody. And it may be that they should be registered fast, and then you can revise it. Yeah. Second, on the data, when I registered my father's death, the PPS number was recorded. Yeah. And there's a potential micro data set which, subject to data protection and so on, the CSO, like those kind of data sets are now being used for research, which would allow you to have very detailed background on the death. And the third thing is, I gave a paper to the Society in 2012 with Nusha Schnudler on life expectancy. What we had a data set from the 2006 census, where we had the deaths related to the CSO, to the census. And what we showed was that 6% of males aged between 20 and 35 died. A really horrific number, hardly any of them due to natural causes. Yeah. For those with, that's with 6% with primary education, 2% with secondary education, 1% with third level. Now, education is not the predictor. It's correlated because poor performance in education may be related, but it would be possible if that data set were made available to do a much more detailed study. And like the 2006 data set that CSO have, if they did it based on the 2022 census, you would be able to see, get a better understanding of why suicide rates and also the other deaths from non-natural causes in that group, are there factors that can predict better what's happening?
Yeah. I'll just keep taking questions and I'll let you reply. So you're okay? You're okay. Shane Whelan.
Thank you, Shane Whelan. It was an excellent paper, somber topic, but it's clearly very important. Two points, I suppose. One is life insurance companies. Life insurance companies, like 50% in the UK anyway, have exclusion clauses for suicide, as for payouts. So that immediately creates a financial incentive for people not to give that ruling, which is suicide, one, or two, perhaps people to conceal their intent, through different ways of going about it. So it seems to me that in order to get good, we must change that, maybe perhaps outlaw it as an exclusion clause. And that
I'm not 100% sure if there are any pure legal people here, but my understanding is that the registration by the coroner need not have the same implication. If they really want to, they can litigate. In other words, it's just a different, they don't necessarily make the life insurance payout determination based on the coroner's decision. Second of all, similarly, the actual inclusion in the CSO data of the ICD-10 is not necessarily dependent on the coroner's decision either. It's the late registration. But subject to somebody correcting me, I looked into that at some point during the paper. Even though there is this thing of like, I don't think it actually impacts. I don't think it would be impacted by this. I looked that up when I get home.
The counterintuitive if it doesn't have an impact. Okay, but okay, accept it. Well, and the second one is that man case in 2018 that changed the precedent in the UK. Would that not apply in Ireland as well, de facto, because we share the same common law? We have decriminalised, as you pointed out, suicide since 1993. So that law must apply in Ireland. It must be the case that we don't have to change any statute. It just has to be now implemented.
Again, this one, just because they occasionally do expert witness work. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure, not being a lawyer or a solicitor or a barrister or whatever, they can take account of English law precedent, but they need not. So it's just, you know what I mean? It's just a weak informative thing that English law precedent informs Irish precedent, but it doesn't form Irish precedent per se. But again, if anybody's a barrister, they're in the room or online, but they get. But I'm pretty sure it doesn't have to be precedent.
It doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be precedent for
but it is looked upon. You know,
it certainly can be.
It is a strong informative base if the laws are very similar.
Yeah.
So it would. So like, but my point is, how would we get this changed in Ireland? Then it would be just taken to the court in some way.
I assume that it could be either that somebody takes a case and similarly or analogously a Supreme Court decision or some, whether a lower court could give the same reason, I would imagine it would have to be ultimately that everybody apply the Supreme Court, or it could be done by explicit statute. They just decide to make it clear, and it need not be for the courts to put something and revise the Coroner's Act or.
Right, see, is there anyone online that would like to ask a question? There's your moment, raise your hand there, turn on your mic. Right.
Okay, just related to John's point about socioeconomic clashing, of course, it'd be nice to have PPS information on the people, but is there anything in your data set already? I don't know how granular it is in terms of location. So where the death is registered, is it a deprived area? Is it any information like that that could proxy?
Not that I'm aware of in public sources, and certainly not in ones we use.
Okay.
There might be within UK if you get, there might be something like like comparing Scotland and England, Wales.
Okay. And then the second question, just in terms of modalities of suicide and the burden of proof. I'm interested in, for example, a hanging. That's undoubtedly nearly like suicide, and men are more likely to choose these more violent means. Whereas for females, it's slightly more ambiguous because they don't choose direct violent means of suicide. So maybe where the burden of proof is on the probability side, that's why we're seeing more women being registered as suicidal or having suicide were on the balance of probabilities, because their means of taking their life is more ambiguous, maybe by drugs or whatever the case may be. Do you have any commentary on that kind of thing?
First of all, the point that it's possible that it's less ambiguous for men because they choose more violent means. I accept that, and I think that's in the data. It's actually 4 times the rate of men, not double. And this is across country, across time, across space, across society. Men are invariably. Now the question of whether it therefore, because women might have different modalities that are potentially more ambiguous, that it would have a bigger impact to change the burden, is a good question, but I don't really have an answer. But certainly a potential future question, or you know, if you got really detailed data, the data can be broken down by modality within the Irish published data. I'm not sure whether they have that by male, female, but anyway, certainly if you got micro data and underlying stuff, you get more and do something.
Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, thank you very much for that very interesting paper. Just wondering, do you think this effect might change over time? That there might be a process longer than your sort of window for this burden of proof to actually really kind of change people's behaviors. And on the margin, in particular, on some cases, they may still be sort of stuck in their old way of thinking a little bit, and that this might actually increase the size of the effect if you were to sort of look at this over longer time.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing a priori that should say that the effect should be stable. I mean, I think within the time period of the study, it's a reasonable assumption that it's stable. But if we can imagine that groups like Samaritans are successful, it might decrease the number of suicides, and then the effect would be smaller. So over, you know, a longer period of time, we can imagine other things happen that are changing the size, the effect.
But do you think that the coroners themselves are changing their behavior instantly with this sort of change in the UK?
That's another good question. And if, you know, what we actually did to study that was we pushed back and forth, we pushed back the treatment effect. It didn't really change the results. But you're right that it might have been longer for them too. They might have had a lagging effect when they changed the behavior. But we did the sensitivities that we could, and it didn't seem to have any effect. And you know, I don't know. The coroners are meant to do a very cut and dried scientific type analysis, and from what the research that we did or that I did, you know, it was fairly came down as universal. I think there was some reason that it wasn't implemented until 3 months later in Northern Ireland or something. But it's pretty much, you know, that this was something that came down as you know, something that's a standard by which they applied. And I don't have any reason to expect a strong lagging effect in behavior change by coroners, because at least on the face of it, they're supposed to be doing things scientifically to a standard. But that's certainly something that could be there.
Can I just add, behind every coroner's report is a guarded investigation, which isn't very quick either. So it's not necessarily coroner's report, can be the whole background investigation as well that really takes time in terms of delays in inquest being held and registered.
Anyone brave enough online to ask a question? With a few people there. Anyone here? So I've one about, I think when you look at these statistics, you definitely want to start thinking about how statistically you could really get at the drivers and at preventative measures like the Samaritans, where, you know, where you could really evaluate different programs and what data you would need, right? But I'm still edging. So you have that time trend, it's just a trend, is it actually by year? Because I'm thinking of I don't know, like by ages, you could put in the leaving cert, or you could put in COVID, or same-sex marriage, or I mean, there could be kind of national events, something that you think are interesting. So did you put dummies instead of a trend? Did you put some year dummies rather than trends?
Well, the DID method is actually year dummies.
Right,
So, and then we do actually the sensitivity to allow a dummy by different time lengths rather than just year by year,
Right.
just be 2 year or 5 year, but it didn't really do anything. I think the broader question is how to get at underlying data that's more useful. And there's really, John already mentioned, is to try to link up microdata. And that is one obvious path. Trying to get CSO to give you like access to census microdata is probably a significant barrier, certainly for a pro bono study, and the time frame is, you know, so there have to be some sort of push or access or time frame there. Probably with enough detailed micro group data, you could come up with something, certainly by, somebody mentioned location. And then if you had something to the order of small area data, which is already publicly available, I'd imagine you'd come up with significant correlations and drivers like that. You get into other things of causality with correlations, but you could do things there with that, or the correlations might be just all you're willing to go with. So I would expect or encourage people to try to do both. You know, if you have the time and effort and access to the microdata, that's the ultimate way to do it. I'd imagine you come up with some pretty solid stuff. But if you're having to make do, probably some group data and correlating with small areas, and you might be able to get locational data and things like that. And if I had to wager, if you gave me 3 to 1, I'd wager we could do something with group data down to small area pretty well. Which would jump the hurdle of huge, like getting actual micro CSO census is fairly challenging.
okay, so anyone online again, last call? Good coffee and mince pies here to eat, so. Oh, there's the question, excellent. Just put your mic online. Oh, Brendan, okay, do you want to come online or I just? Is there any analysis of single vehicle crash fatalities as means of suicide? Somebody suggested that.
I don't know, but I would say no, in the sense that it's either, there's different registrations and there's ones that are obvious suicides where they're determined by a coroner's court, or it's classified in ICD-10, and then whatever the classification is, you're just going to see that data, and you won't know if it's single, you won't have that kind of detail. The microdata might have it somewhere. I'd mentioned in just other work we've done for RSA, there's a very, very detailed data set of accidents data that they have as microdata. But you'd be looking at interrogating some of that to see if you could somehow determine the potential, I think, without getting the Garda report. But you're still going to be in an ambiguity thing. You have to look at the Garda report and go and then somehow know which ones were subsequently classed as a suicide, that sort of thing. So somewhere there's data that could be linked up in theory that it'd be very, 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 very different.
Okay. So, John, do we have an announcement for the next meeting?
At the moment, it looks like the next meeting is going to be in last Thursday of February. I'm seeing if I can get one in between in January. At the moment, the schedule is the last Thursday in February, and we'll be down in Cork.
Or down. Okay. On the topic of that, or
Dermot Coates going to present a paper on productivity.
Okay. So thank you so much for coming to present today, and 2 excellent folks. Thanks in discussions. Yeah, so we look forward to getting these into the journal, and we can disseminate them to a few policymakers and CSO people to see what they think of the discourse, and we can make some recommendations. Okay, thank you.
See? Work with the data, you get the deaths by county. And you may well be able to get them by double postal list. But it's like, yeah, they wouldn't be available.